Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome back to Tech Talks, our virtual speaker series focused on technology ethics. My name is Elizabeth Ranieris, and I'm the founding director of the Notre Dame IBM Technology Ethics Lab. Along with my colleague, Kristen Martin, director of the Notre Dame Technology Ethics Center, we're very happy to welcome you back to our 7th and final Tech Talk of this semester. It's hard to believe. This series is focused on technology and power. It's examined how the speed and breadth of technological advancement risks replicating historical and systemic racism, discrimination, and inequity across many aspects of our lives. We've also considered how individuals and entities with the power and resources to develop and deploy new technologies often generate significant financial, social, and political capital, while marginalized members of society are often excluded from their benefits or made to bear the brunt of their harms. We've been joined by leading academics, practitioners, and activists to explore questions such as who reaps the benefits of new technologies and who suffers the harms or consequences. How is technology reshaping or reinforcing existing power dynamics in society, including with respect to gender and race? And can technology distribute power more equitably? And if so, how? The proliferation and ubiquity of smartphones, smart devices, AI-powered personal assistants, home security cameras, self-driving vehicles, and many other connected things has led to the collection of biometric and personal data on an unprecedented scale, rapidly eroding privacy and enabling new forms of surveillance. Coupled with advances in augmented, virtual, and mixed reality, this phenomenon has far-reaching social, political, and economic implications for individuals and societies as a whole. Today, we explore these implications and discuss how individuals and communities can respond to these new technological realities that threaten not just privacy, but related values. And we're joined by two of the most prominent names in the field. First up, we have Dr. Carissa Velis, an associate professor at the Faculty of Philosophy and at the Institute for Ethics and AI, and a fellow at Hertford College at the University of Oxford. Dr. Velis was previously a research fellow at Oxford's UHERA Center for Practical Ethics and the Wellcome Center for Ethics and Humanities. Her work is focused on privacy, AI ethics, moral and political philosophy, and public policy. Dr. Velis is the author of Privacy is Power, which was named an Economist Book of the Year in 2020, and the editor of the forthcoming Oxford Handbook of Digital Ethics. She completed her PhD in philosophy at the University of Oxford. We are also joined by Albert Fox-Kahn, the founder and executive director of the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, or STOP, a New York-based civil rights and privacy group. He's also a fellow at Yale Law School's Information Society Project and the Engelberg Center for Innovation, Law and Policy at NYU School of Law, among many other affiliations. Albert frequently comments on civil rights, privacy, and technology matters, and he's contributed to the New York Times, Guardian, Wired, and numerous other publications. He's lectured at many prestigious law schools to name here and has practiced law in private practice. Albert received his JD cum laude from Harvard Law School and his BA in politics and philosophy from Brandeis University. Carissa and Albert, thank you so much for being here today with us to discuss privacy and power. I'm really excited about ending on this theme. We'll be connecting a lot of dots, hopefully, that we've been, some of the points we've been making across the course of the semester. So as in prior sessions, I'll lead us in a discussion for about 30 to 40 minutes. Then we'll turn to some questions from our registries. And then for those of you in the Zoom, if you'd like to submit questions, there should be a link in the chat. For those watching in the live stream, you can submit your questions through the link in the comments there. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So as the world is once again thrown into this great uncertainty in the face of the newly discovered Omicron variant of coronavirus, I'd like to begin with the pandemic. And the role that technologies deployed during or in response to the pandemic are playing in this phenomenon in terms of the changing nature of privacy. I think I'll probably start with Carissa here. So I'd like to ask what you've observed during the COVID-19 pandemic with respect to privacy and power. Have you observed any shifting power dynamics or how power dynamics may have changed during the pandemic, particularly with respect to technologies designed or deployed by the private sector?
Thank you so much for having me, Elizabeth. It's such a pleasure to be here. The pandemic has been obviously a game changer for everyone. And there are some obvious movements relevant to privacy and power and some less obvious ones. So the obvious one is that we have been forced to spend a lot more time online, which means our data is collected a lot more than it would otherwise. And with that, there are some less obvious implications. One of them is that for more than a decade, tech companies have sold us a narrative that anything we do with tech is voluntary, that it's up to us to consent, and if we don't want to, then we can just not. And the pandemic has really made it so obvious that it's not voluntary, that if you want to be a full participant in society, you have to agree to use some of these platforms if you want an education, if you want a job, if you want even connection with your loved ones during the pandemic, you have to use these technologies. And so that narrative is rapidly losing its kind of its truth ring or its convincingness. Within the private sector, there have been a few interesting dynamics. So one was the pandemic made it tangible how sometimes big tech has much more power than even powerful governments. So an example was when the UK government wanted to deploy an app for track and trace that was centralized, and Apple and Google decided that they were only going to support apps that were not centralized. In that case, it seemed like a good thing because Apple and Google were actually protecting us more than certain governments like the UK government. But it just shows that it's kind of scary that private companies like Apple and Google can overpower a government that is traditionally seen as one of the powerful governments in the world, such as the UK government. In the end, the UK government tried to do its app and it failed miserably. And it kind of showed how much power big tech has. Other interesting developments were the private and public deals that were made to process data, in particular with companies like Amazon, but also a company like Palantir. Palantir made deals with the UK government, but as well with the CDCs in the United States and with other agencies in the United States. And we are seeing more and more that our data is not safe in either the hands of the government or in the hands of corporations because they share so much data between themselves that it's almost impossible to distinguish between corporate surveillance and government surveillance. Another interesting dynamic was that once again, as with many other crises like 9/11, but others as well, privacy is one of the first things to get sacrificed or to get asked to be sacrificed in the name of a crisis. And now I think it's time to view how much privacy we lost and was it necessary, and to learn for future cases. I think we were a little bit less naive than in 9/11. I think there were more people saying, wait a second, we've heard this before, it didn't quite work out. Why exactly do you need this data? And so on. So I saw a lot more resistance than a few years ago, than I think we would have seen a few years ago. And now, for instance, there have been a few meta studies that try to figure out whether all this data that was used, for instance, for AI tools was actually useful. And in two meta studies that were reported by the MIT Technology Review, it showed that out of hundreds of tools developed, AI tools developed to deal with a pandemic in hospitals and so on, only one had some clinical promise. It wasn't even clear. All of the rest hadn't worked. So it's a wake-up call to, it's not that AI doesn't work, it's not that we don't, we have to ditch it, but it's just to put it into perspective that it's not a magic wand. And whenever we're asked for data to save lives, we have to stop for a second and think about it. And in this case, it turns out that these AI tools didn't save lives. And in fact, they might have hurt patients. So I think we have been a lot more, it's been a course in education on data and power, the pandemic.
Sorry, there are just so many things I wanted to pick up on there. If it's okay, Elizabeth, I just want, well, one thing I want to flag, and Carissa, I'd love your thoughts on this. It seems like the power that the private sector had was quite expansive, but it's also, it's asymmetrical in that they had a lot of power to block certain deployments of, contact tracing tech, but they didn't actually have the power to do that sort of function well themselves. So I'm struck, thinking about here in New York, where we basically outsource to Google to develop our contact tracing program. And, the hope was that this would mitigate the spread of COVID-19. It would reduce the need for widespread testing. And it was an abject failure. We had, millions of downloads. We had very few potential exposure events that were detected. And one thing that I'm really struck by is, yes, we've seen this massive power that, these tech companies have to track us, to get this intimate data, to build these location maps of our lives. But ultimately, they didn't actually have the power to do the one thing that they were trying to do, which was build apps that mitigated the spread of COVID-19. And so in that way, it made me feel like they were also powerless. So do you think that that they had the ability to do this, to intervene more successfully? Am I just being like sort of the snarky sort of contrarian, or was this also a sort of a failure for them?
I totally agree with you. I think it was a failure, and it was a case of hammers looking for nails. So whenever there's a crisis, we turn to the biggest companies for help. And if the biggest companies had been, manufacturers of different kinds, we might have gotten masks and gel and so on. But because the biggest companies were tech companies, what they can offer are apps. And apps wasn't necessarily what we needed. We needed vaccines, we needed protective equipment, we needed a lot of other things. And it really shows how a proxy for infection is very, very, very far from actual infection. And that's one of the main reasons why these apps were so limited. So I completely agree with you.
And for me, one of the things that was so frustrating about all of this is that the pandemic offers impossible choices. Do you shut down your economy? Do you see people die who otherwise could have been kept safe? These are sort of choices no one in power would ever want to make. And yet the tech companies come in, they offer these magical alternatives. They say, we can use your data as an alternative, as a way to provide this magical alternative way to keep your society open and keep people safe. It doesn't work, and then there doesn't seem to be any consequences for that failure to actually live up to that marketing pledge. So I'm really struck that there doesn't seem to have been a response in the broader public view of these companies, where people don't seem to be more skeptical of those marketing claims as a result of the mass failure.
That's incredible, and that's something that I constantly come across. This unbelievable optimism in technology. And I'm thinking, don't you have phones? Don't you have computers? Don't they fail all the time? Or is it just me? Is it just like tech hates me and I have glitches all the time? Like tech is so fragile, so much fragile than our analog technology. So I completely agree with you. And maybe we have to think more about the kind of rules to put in place, even when there's a crisis, for the government to give out public money for a certain project. Like, do we have to have some sort of evidence that it might work, at least, like some kind of minimum requirement?
Yeah, and I do think that is one of the things that I keep pushing in the broader smart cities discourse around municipal data capture, that anytime you're seeing this arbitrage of data for public service, where someone is offering a system in exchange for being able to collect a lot of data, that the baseline prerequisite for any of these systems should be proof that it actually does the job. Because the vast majority of the time you have marketing claims, but you don't have any actual third-party verifiable evidence that the system is going to work well. I think that certainly is something we saw here, not just with the exposure notification, but with AI optimization of vaccine delivery. We saw the protests out at Stanford, where they used a really crude algorithm to allocate the vaccine. And really, to me, it's sort of, we've seen the most unbridled optimism and the most abject failures to realize those optimistic goals during the crisis.
Absolutely. At the moment, the fact of the matter is you can come up with an algorithm to do basically anything you wanted to do and let it loose onto the world with no supervision and no consequences when things go wrong. And something I've been arguing for, I have a piece about it at the Harvard Business Review, is that we should subject algorithms to randomized control trials. We would never agree to let a drug loose into the world without having those kind of rigorous testing, not even in a crisis like the pandemic. We still waited for randomized control trials with the vaccines. So why do we do it with algorithms that can be just as harmful as the most harmful of drugs? They can kill people, they can wreck lives.
So I'm going to just jump in here. I told you this could moderate itself. But it is really interesting that you've kind of immediately honed in on the importance of narratives here. I do want to just, before we dive deeper into that, I did want to just turn to the public sector as well, because one of the criticisms many public health experts were raising early on in the pandemic was that the public sector had been following a kind of private sector model of, running lean and efficient and with limited kind of redundancy and not being able to respond, not having the sort of long-term capacity and resources to respond to a crisis like the pandemic. And Albert, I know you do a lot of work around governments and public sector entities. And I'm curious, a similar question to Chris at the outset around what some of the impacts of the pandemic have been with respect to the power dynamics between people and states and governments, state and local governments, and the federal government as well. And how has the public sector responded when they've had their own implementations or kind of gone at this themselves? And feel free to bring in examples, both domestic and from other countries as well.
Yeah, one of the things that really has terrified me throughout this has been well, first off, the rapid politicization of what should be a unifying public health crisis that, you look around the world and you see countries where even though they have, really fierce domestic political fights, they're not turning the pandemic itself into one. So I'm thinking particularly of Peru, which had one of the highest fatality rates from COVID-19 around the world, truly devastated by the pandemic. They also have a very fierce political debate right now, and may impeach their president. And despite all this, you see a lot of unity about, things like masks, things like vaccination, things like, those sort of public health responses. And here in the US, what we saw was that, instant politicization of the pandemic. And then at the state and local level, we saw this really disturbing trend towards the centralization of power. So we saw unprecedented use of emergency orders. Here in New York, Governor Andrew Cuomo was authorized to issue essentially any executive order on any matter of law, period. It was truly stunning. In my mind, it was an abdication of Republican government as required by the US Constitution. And as a result, we saw a government response that was much more sped up than is normally allowed, because we do tend to have clunkier governance models at the state and local level. It can be slower than the private sector, but you saw a lot of things that came much more quickly as a result, including some decisions that were disastrous. So you saw everything from, the deployment of these new tracking requirements. We had vaccine checkpoints to try to detect domestic travel. We had a lot of health data being aggregated in new and completely unreliable ways. And we just saw really this entire new infrastructure being built up really rapidly, and oftentimes really poorly. And this has led to everything from large products that were deployed to fight the pandemic that were subsequently abandoned. It led to scandals sort of like around data manipulation around COVID deaths, and everything in between.
Did you want to jump in, Carissa?
Yeah, no, I basically agree. And back to the comment you offered about narratives. One of the things that I've realized in the past few years is that big tech, but also kind of tech enthusiasts, are even better at offering narratives than they are at offering tech. And at some point, so I got into philosophy partly because I could see like the philosophical undertext of society, ideas like the social contract and so on. I could feel like philosophical ideas have been so important in shaping our society. And at some point I got a bit disillusioned, and I thought, no, maybe philosophy is not that important. Maybe just, people don't listen to us at all. And it's just like something kind of niche, and only like 25 academics are going to read about it and so on. But as time has gone on, I feel like this battle between power, really different strands of power, and this battle for democracy as a citizenry partly has to be won in the narratives. And so I think that's a very insightful point that you made.
And on the point of narratives, I really want to call out the work of Evan Selinger at RIT. He's an amazing writer in this space, and he's written a bit about the good faith and bad faith arguments we see being made in the pandemic about government abuse of data, about government abuse of power, and just how hard it is when we see people cloaking, anti-vaccine conspiracy theories and other anti-health messaging in the same narrative that of government overreach, that we see good faith arguments being used, whether it's opposing bad tech or opposing algorithmic discrimination. And I do think it's really one of the more confusing parts of this moment in history that all sides of the argument have been so effective in weaponizing very similar narratives to make diametrically opposed points. And I'm not sure how, especially given our media, echo chambers and silos, how you move beyond that, particularly when those narratives are so effective at this particular moment.
So it's quite interesting that we're at the last Tech Talk of the semester. This theme around narratives and language and storytelling has emerged time and time again, regardless of what the topic of our Tech Talk has been, because I think you're right that really this is a central problem or concern. And when you think about privacy, actually, as a privacy lawyer, I think about how privacy has kind of become this, overarching term or narrative in itself as kind of the prime and only value in a democratic society. I think one of the things we observed, as you noted, in respect to the early contact tracing exposure notification apps, was a lot of language around privacy preserving technologies or privacy enhancing technologies, or the use of things like pseudonymization and anonymization techniques, or localized machine learning, or all these different mathematical and computational tools and methods to basically say that it's okay to sort of design and deploy these things in a privacy preserving way. But turning back to the conversation of today, which is technology and power, how do you think that the sort of marketing and language and narratives around some of these privacy enhancing and preserving techniques impacted the levels of power, perhaps, that the tech companies had over the discourse at the start of the pandemic and ongoing? Maybe we start with Carissa.
So one way in which it's impacted is that big tech, like any good company and like any big company and any effective companies, tend to try to co-opt language. So as soon as particular language like privacy preserving or AI for good or AI ethics, those kind of terms start to become popular, they immediately try to catch on and make them theirs. And that's something that we have to be very vigilant about, because power is encoded in language. And I think one of our duties as independent researchers is to talk truth to power and say it how it is, and not use euphemisms, and be sure to kind of own that kind of language. So something that I want to emphasize, and I think challenges these ideas about technology and big tech and their narratives, is that the mere fact of digitalizing something entails surveillance. I call this the iron law of digitalization. There's no digitizing something without surveilling it. Digitizing something means turning it into something trackable, searchable. And what is to track something if it's not to surveil it? And data is not like mushrooms that we find in the woods, or like butterflies that we catch. It's something that we create. We decide what to turn into data and what to not turn into data. And I think all of the big tech companies, and possibly all of tech companies in general, even the ones who might be well-intentioned and want to protect privacy, don't see this. A camera is a surveillance equipment. It doesn't matter if it's encrypted. It doesn't matter if your pictures are on your phone. It's still a surveillance equipment, and that matters. And that's a moral decision, and it's meaningful in a way that I think a lot of people who are enthusiastic about tech don't really realize. So one analogy that I use is like digitizing something is like analogous to builders. It's in the nature of builders to pave over natural areas. And if we ask them, hey, can you please not do that? It's just like, it's not in their nature, right? So only if we set limits as a society, if there are regulations for where you can pave and where you can't, will we have natural areas protected. And in the same way, it's in the nature of tech companies to turn what's analogous. I'm sorry, what's the term in English? I'm mixing.
No, analogous. Yeah.
Analogous, thanks. What's analogous into the digital? It's in their nature to do that. And even if we tell them, hey, can you please not, turn everything into a spy? They're just not gonna do that because that's the way in which they grow. And so until society decides, okay, we're not gonna digitize this part of life, maybe not all conversations should be turned into data. Maybe, we should be careful about augmented and virtual reality, unless society sets limits for what can be digitized and what can not be digitized, then surveillance is just going to grow.
Alberto, turn it over to you.
Yeah, no, I agree with all that. I mean, when we talk about privacy by design, oftentimes people talk about, de-identifying data minimization, but oftentimes the best privacy safeguard with any potential system is not building it. And, oftentimes as an advocate, someone who's opposing police surveillance, other municipal surveillance programs, that's what we're trying to do. It's not trying to create a complicated regulatory schema. It's trying to just ban these systems altogether, because even when you have a regulatory framework that theoretically could prevent abuse of these sorts of systems, there's a big gap between that and actual implementation and consistent implementation preventing abuse. This is going to sound a bit strange coming from someone who runs an anti-surveillance nonprofit, but I constantly tell my staff that I don't think the American people care about privacy. And I don't say that because I don't think they care about the things that privacy means to me, because to me, privacy translates to state power. It translates to questions of life and death. It translates to the future of democracy. But I think that translation work isn't implied for the vast majority of people. I think that when we turn these surveillance debates, these technology debates into questions around privacy, that we oftentimes are going to lose the public. And that's why, I tend to focus much more on those questions of power, on the questions of how, what are the abuses that these systems make possible? How does it further discrimination? How does it, in the case of police technology, potentially lead to police violence and even death? And I think those sort of much more concrete costs have to be centered in the narrative, or every time people will choose some sort of perceived benefit over an abstract, more philosophical harm from those systems. And that may just be my jaundiced view of the American political dynamic, having come of age post 9/11 and seen that debate fail over and over again. But I really think that it's these narratives have to center the lived experiences of those harmed by those technologies and make it as concrete as possible.
It's a really interesting point you make on privacy. I recently read one of our colleague, Woodrow Hartzog's review of some of Daniel Salov's work around, how this fixation with kind of getting at what privacy is or defining privacy has in some ways set the field back, right? Because it's a bit of an elusive concept. And yet, Chris, obviously you've written a really acclaimed book around privacy as power. So I'm curious from your perspective, if you could share with us how you define privacy and why you think it's the correct framing.
So I completely agree that privacy is too elusive and too abstract to many times be effective in some of these conversations that we're having. So in the book, I actually don't define privacy precisely for that reason. I say that, I write that it has to do with keeping certain kinds of information that make you vulnerable, safe from others that could abuse that information and abuse their power. So that's a kind of really intuitive way to think about it. And I think it's true. In my dissertation and my forthcoming academic book, I give a much more technical definition about what exactly is personal data and how do we define that and what does count as personal access and so on. But I think that's not as useful for the public policy debates for that reason. And so I think in my book, I try to focus on the power side more than the privacy in the sense that it doesn't matter whether you care about privacy or not. Presumably you care about keeping your money safe and keeping your family safe and not being discriminated against and not being publicly humiliated and not having a dictatorship and all of these things. So that's what I mainly focus on. And in a forthcoming chapter for the Oxford Handbook of Digital Ethics, I call these idea that that surveillance always seems so advantageous. It has like so many perks and you don't see the downside of it. There's the surveillance delusion. And the idea is that the harms of privacy typically come years, months after the fact. They don't feel like anything in the moment. And many times they're not quantifiable. So for instance, if I build an app to track people, it's very easy for me to make a calculation that might be completely untrue. But at the moment, it seems true of how many lives I could possibly save. But it's not easy to quantify the erosion of democracy or the erosion of equality because we're not being treated as equal citizens anymore. We're being treated on the basis of our data. Or the kind of chilling effect that we might have, and writers self-censoring in what they research and what they write. How do you quantify that loss for society? It's very hard. And so there's an illusion that surveillance only has advantages and no disadvantages that can, at the end of the day, make us lose much more valuable things, but that we just couldn't see at the moment, and we couldn't put a tag on it or a number. So I think that's the surveillance delusion that is quite dangerous. So I think I agree with both of you that we should maybe focus more on the power side of the debate when it comes to public policy, and maybe in more academic circles we can talk about like the details of what exactly is privacy and how do we define it.
Yeah, and I say this all as someone who's written a lot of articles about privacy, so I definitely think that it's really important in the academy for us to wrestle with this, even when I think that when you're looking at the rhetoric that moves the electorate and the narratives that help get a new law passed, that's where grounding it in those sorts of harms you were talking about, Carissa, is so important. And I don't know, I'm hopeful that because we have a couple of decades of rampant surveillance growth, post 9/11 here in the US, and obviously with parallel developments in much of Europe, that we've gotten to the point where we have enough data about the harms that people are starting to take their heads out of the sand. That really, it was, back in 2001, a lot of us were saying this is a really terrifying road to go down. And back then it felt very hypothetical, just the ways these powers could be abused. But now it feels like none of it's hypothetical anymore. It feels like we've seen where it goes, and very few of us want to go to that place.
I want to jump more into the harms because I think this is where it does get really concrete, right? So we do find that privacy is elusive, and it's the definition is really hard to nail down, and yet the harms do feel very concrete, and they are kind of stacking. And I think one of the things I've observed is that they're sort of revealing that privacy is enabling other things, right? Whether it's dignity or whether it's autonomy. And there's also sort of this narrative shift away from privacy when we think more about, an automated society. So for example, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy is now developing a Bill of Rights for an automated society. So going back to your point, Carissa, about sort of digitization inherently becoming or enabling surveillance, what do you make of governments and societies sort of embracing an automated society or a digital society? And how do you reconcile upholding privacy and related rights and values with the shifting kind of narrative towards accepting that this is the future or present that we live in?
Yeah, I don't think there's a reconciliation. That's the thing. So I think that surveillance equipment is designed, it has the affordance to control. And the more we control people, the less freedom we will have. And it doesn't seem to be something that we can wiggle out of and build it in such a way that it's not going to have that effect. If you surveil, you control. If you control, people have less freedom. So I think that we have to think more about the kinds of areas and the kinds of times and spaces that we want to keep free of any kind of surveillance and any kind of digitization. And I agree with Albert that we have more data to defend this view. And if you haven't had your identity stolen, first of all, wait a few years, you will have it. And if not, you know somebody for whom it's happened. You know somebody who has run into trouble. And if it's not identity theft, it's public humiliation online. If it's not that, it's some kind of injustice with an AI algorithm that either denied you a loan or gave you an exam mark that you didn't deserve or something or other. More and more people are having very negative experiences that are the result of surveillance and AI. So the more bad experiences we accumulate, well, we become more savvy, and we kind of are reminded of the values that are necessary for a healthy democracy.
Albert, you've been very close to some of these harms on the ground, so to speak. Do you mind sharing some of what you've observed, and also explaining why this, AI-enabled tools are any worse than, say, a CCTV network?
Well, CCTV network is increasingly part of that AI tool, as we see. And I think that's a really important example because it's a reminder that all of this is cumulative, that when you see the hardware being installed, that it's an invitation to then have a new layer of biometric analysis, to then have a new layer of automated computer vision that's doing some sort of modeling. But when I think of the harms, I'm thinking of a young client of mine. He was in his 20s and he had gone on a trip overseas, and he got back home. He was jet lagged, he was tired, and suddenly had FBI agents at his door asking him questions. And because his behavior pattern, simply traveling combined with his name, had been enough to label him a threat. And this is what we see it over and over again, people living their lives, going through mundane activity, and then suddenly there is a person with a gun standing in their home asking them questions because they have been flagged by these systems. And if as Carissa was saying, if you haven't experienced this, it is something where increasingly it's increasingly common. But I don't think it's the same as identity theft, because we know overwhelmingly it's BIPOC individuals, it's members of the Massa community who are going to experience this. So if you're a wealthy, privileged, white individual, you may not know anyone who has had an officer come to their door because of this. But if you're a Muslim New Yorker who has seen the NYPD infiltrate your mosques and community groups for years, who's seen your communities mapped out by surveillance systems, then yeah, you probably do know someone who has had one of these visits, who knows just how terrifying it is and knows the risks that come with it. Those are the cases that I think we need to do a better job of just sharing, not just the people who are wrongfully imprisoned, as awful as those cases are, not just the people who face those more extreme injustices, but just the trauma of having someone coming and invading the most intimate parts of your life because of your name, because of the faith you practice or the color of your skin, combined with the invasiveness and bias of the sort of AI tools that are being used.
So as we're getting towards the end of the session here, I want to start turning towards what can be done and what we can do. As I noted earlier, in the US, we've got federal level efforts. We have some interesting state level initiatives and even more local initiatives. Albert, I was curious if you wanted to share some of your views on what the New York City Council is proposing. I think it's a first mover, as far as I'm aware, first mover type of law at a state or local level in the United States around corporate disclosures and potential harms there. what do you make of the law? Maybe you can help us understand more about it. And do you think it's a good potential partial solution to this?
So there are a few different things that are pending here in New York, and generally, my approach to legislation is keep it very simple. So just outlaw technologies completely. Don't try to come up with complicated legislative schemes, but just clear bans. And the other thing is, rather than trying to prevent the private sector from gathering this data in the first place, I focus on creating a legal firewall to prevent that data from then being used by police and other government agencies. In terms of the council bill here in New York, we do have one on employment AI that just was passed by the council. And that's one I actually pushed back against quite a bit. It's something that calls for a audit of AI hiring tools before they're sold. But unfortunately, a number of advocacy groups and I saw it as basically a rubber stamp for some of the worst and most biased AI hiring tools out there, simply because it doesn't define what is needed in an audit. There's no actual enforcement. The bill is entirely left up to a one city public agency to enforce, even though that agency has said it doesn't have the talent or the budget or the staffing to do so. I think, I am hopeful we will see more laws around the country, and particularly laws that, let people who've been targeted by these technologies have their day in court. Every other civil rights protection we've seen effectively push back against injustice over the last 100 years in the United States has had that role for, the plaintiff's bar to sue when people go too far. And so that's part of the laws that we're pushing, including, bans on drones, bans on facial recognition, bans on other forms of predictive policing technology, and really just trying to, push pause on this sort of Black Mirror episode before it turns into just an inescapable reality.
So it's interesting about the firewalls. I know you've also written about how a lot of these public entities, particularly law enforcement, are obtaining data from data brokers from the private sector. And Carissa, in your book, you go into great detail about the data economy and push back against the data collection in the first place, right? I'd hope you could elaborate on kind of this relationship between the public and private sector and how you view data brokers and where at which point you would intervene to really start pushing back against some of this.
Yeah, so in my book, and the paperwork is coming out in the US in a month, I argue that we should ban the trade in personal data. As long as personal data can be bought and sold, there are two negative incentives. One is to collect more than you need because you can always profit from it. And the second one is to sell it to the highest bidder, which oftentimes is not the institution or the organization that you want the data with. In terms of where to intervene, I think the most important part is to not collect the data in the first place for a variety of reasons. One reason is that data is very hard to keep safe. So even if you have a lot of money and you're very well-intentioned, it's almost impossible to keep it safe if a hacker really, really wants it and spends enough time and resources to get that data. So it's something like a ticking bomb. I argue that we should think about personal data as a toxic asset, and we should get rid of it as soon as we can. We can use it, but it's toxic. So we have to have measures to delete it very quickly and not to share it around too much because, among other reasons, it's a national security liability. So what I worry about is that if we ban certain uses, say we ban data brokers from sharing data with the government, it's very easy to find a loophole. I worry about it. So I worry that they will find a way to share insights, and it doesn't count as data because it's not the personal data. It's just like the conclusion from the data that the data broker has. So I think it's important to intervene at the moment of data collection. And I think that the most rational system would be one in which people have to actually opt in to share certain kinds of data. And even then, we should have limits as to what kind of data people can share and what kind of inferences can be made. But at the moment, the system is such that your data gets collected even before you consent to it. And then sometimes you get the opportunity to say no more data collection or something like that. By that time, many times hundreds of corporations already have your data and they get to keep it. You have no way of auditing that, making sure that they delete that data or what happens to it. And furthermore, every time you go into a website, you have to say, no, please don't collect my data. And I waste hours and hours just saying, please don't collect my data. It's totally nonsensical. Whereas if you had to opt in, then you only have to opt in once. And if you don't want to opt in, then you wouldn't have to say no all the time. So that's one place. Data brokers are really dangerous at the moment because they have so much data on people and they make such sensitive inferences. And I think if people got to see some of the categories that they get boxed into with data brokers, they would get a lot more freaked out than if, I just tell them your data is being collected by data brokers. That's so abstract. But it includes things like being the victim of a rape, suffering from premature ejaculation, having lost a kid in an accident, like really sensitive things. You can, just by the categories, you can realize that these companies are looking for where we hurt the most, our vulnerabilities, and then sharing that with whoever wants to buy it, which is just such a bad idea. So in the book, I have about 20 or so initiatives. Another important thing that I think we should take into account is to try to legislate in such a way that is not technology specific. So say we ban facial recognition, that would be great. But we have gait recognition, which we have heartbeat recognition and so on. So we should try to regulate for any kind of technology that identifies people, because that's really what we want to protect, the ability to be anonymous, particularly in the physical world where walking down the street and so on. Another important one is fiduciary duties. If anybody wants to collect or manage personal data, they should accept a duty of care. With great power comes great responsibility. Data gives people great power. It's not okay just to collect that data and then not be responsible for it and use it in ways that could harm the data subjects. So those are just a few ones, but I have more in the book.
I agree with all of that, and we should all be taking more guidance from Spider-Man in our life as well. But there is one point where I disagree a bit, and that was on the potential of banning the data collection altogether. And maybe this is my pessimism, but part of the reason I focus on these legal firewalls and saying, let's stop the police from buying this data from data brokers versus rather than trying to stop the data brokers altogether, is I haven't seen evidence that there's political will for people to actually give up this data arbitrage where they're giving up data for free services. And I'm worried that if we try to outlaw the data brokers altogether, and suddenly you have to pay, for Gmail, you have to pay for Google Maps, you have to pay for all these systems rather than just paying with your data, that we can't get those enacted. Whereas, I'm hopeful that if we can say, okay, these private companies can still exploit your data, as creepy as it is, but you no longer have to worry about being thrown in jail. You no longer have to worry about being deported. You no longer have to worry about those anti-democratic abuses of your data, that's attainable, at least in the short term. But again, I might just be too pessimistic after all of these years of Silicon Valley growth.
I don't know. I think that on the one hand, that's optimistic because it kind of assumes that the government is not going to actually use that data when it's convenient to them, that a national security agency is not going to hack it, or that we're not going to have a foreign government hack it and have like really bad consequences. And it's also, it seems to me like what I'm most worried is, of course, government surveillance is very disturbing because the government can do things like jail you and so on. But I'm equally disturbed by the erosion of equality and polarization. And all of this is being driven by the business model of the data economy. So a few things that make me optimistic are: one, personal data is a true liability for national security. And if the United States cares about anything, it's about national security. So it doesn't matter whether people care about it or not. We have a reason not to have as much personal data sloshing around. And something to prove that there's reason for optimism is that China, the country most, known for its surveillance, actually passed a very strong privacy law. And of course, nobody expects the Chinese government not to surveil, but still they're minimizing the amount of data collected by a lot. And people have hypothesized, why would China do this? It costs their market $1 trillion and so on. I think one reason they do it is that they don't want to have that liability. They know that that personal data is sensitive, and sooner or later, the West is going to hack it, just like they're trying to hack our data. So I think that that's an important point. Another reason for optimism is that we've done it before. We have had certain kind of business models that have been very profitable, and we've decided that it's just too toxic for society. And I do think that the data economy is as toxic a business model as theft. In many ways, it works in the same way. And so I think there's reason for optimism just in looking at history. A final reason for optimism is that much of the data economy depends on marketing and personalized ads. And many times that's where the data first gets collected and then it gets passed on. And there's reason to think that the personal data market, the personal ads market is a bubble. That personal ads are very expensive. They actually don't work as well, so they're not worth it. And when people realize that they've been paying a lot of money for absolutely nothing, it's going to collapse and create a financial crisis. So I think there are different elements that can help us and be a little bit more ambitious in the kind of society that we want and the kind of legislation we want to pass. But maybe I'm too optimistic. I don't know.
No, I like the optimism, and I'd love to end on an optimistic note. Since we only have about 5 minutes left, and I'm just looking at the questions here, we probably only have time for one or two. So maybe in 2 minutes or less, I'd love for each of you to weigh in on how we stay safe in a world that's going to have things like Web3 or the metaverse or virtual and mixed reality. What are your sort of most optimistic ways that we can stay safe in a future that looks very different from the one we're in right now? Albert, do you want to start there?
Yeah, the professional myopia that comes with as being a lawyer is you think that law is the solution to everything. And so I do think that an element of this is just things are getting so bad that the political will is increasingly there to take action. And without just all of these sort of wholesale commandeering of our digital lives, without all of the horrific impacts that Carissa has been talking about, without being able to, speak to lawmakers who are personally impacted by these platforms themselves, it's not possible to really enact the sort of protections we need. But in the next 5 years, I think we have this golden moment, this narrow window to take action when things are so bad that they no longer can be denied, and yet are not yet entrenched enough in our society to be irreversible. Because I think that if we do actually implement this sort of regulations and laws and bans that we need in that window, we'll be able to back away from the brink of this very bleak dystopia that I am dreading and really embrace the more optimistic vision for the future that Carissa was laying out.
So again, in the book, I have like a whole chapter of what people can do. And basically, we have to resist the data economy. And we don't have to be perfect for it. Even if you try to be perfect, you will fail. But many times, even trying is hugely important because it gives companies and governments the message that we actually do care. And it creates a paper trail such that when regulators look at that company and the company says, yeah, we did this horrible thing, but our users were really happy to give us our data, you can actually document that you weren't happy, that you were asking for your data to be deleted and so on. And we only need 5 to 10% of people to do a good amount of resistance for things to change. We don't have to have like the vast majority of people. So we have a lot more power than we think, and partly because these companies totally depend on our data. And if we resist, they have nothing. They don't have a product they sell. Many of these companies like Facebook and Google. And more in general, to not get accustomed to it. Like, this is not normal. This is a business model that depends on the systematic of mass violation of rights. And it's not acceptable, and we shouldn't get used to it, and we should resist it. And it's not that hard. It doesn't take that much of an effort, and you can make a much bigger difference than you imagine.
And in the 2 minutes we have remaining, we'll wrap up with the last question, which is, again, in sort of a minute or less, what ethically inclined companies should do about the predicament that we're in? Any top tips here? Albert, do you want to take this one first as well?
I mean, just stop it. Stop building these products when you don't actually know that they're providing the sort of benefit you hope they will. You know, I know that Silicon Valley values that risk taking. I know that people are constantly trying to build vaporware on aspiration and fix it all in beta. People are being hurt, right? And it's not enough to simply have a great pitch deck and a hope for the future. You actually need due diligence. And that means reinventing how the software is made and how these tools are deployed.
So no more move fast and break things.
We have to work. Yeah, sorry. We have to work for privacy. So one of the things that I'm most concerned about right now in how geopolitics is how China is exporting surveillance. It's exporting surveillance to about 150 countries. And that means that not only does it get access to that kind of really sensitive data around the world, but it also gets the possibility of turning off smart cities. And that's such a reckless thing to do. So if China is exporting surveillance, our duty in Europe and in the United States is to export privacy. Export privacy in technology, in standards, in laws, and in narratives. And this is something we have to do together, and companies can play a very, very big part in figuring out how to export privacy to counterbalance that very, very negative influence of the Chinese government exporting surveillance.
Privacy is a competitive advantage.
Exactly. And I would just say if they need it boiled down to a simple motto, move slow and fix things.
Perfect.
I like that.
I think that's a perfect way to wrap. We are out of time. Thank you so much again to both of you for being here. Thank you for everyone who's tuned in to this series and the last. All of our recordings are available for a limited time online at our website. We will definitely circulate materials mentioned in this talk, as we always do. But thank you again to Albert and Carissa. I know we all learned a lot from you, and it was a perfect way to wrap our series. So thank you for being here, and we hopefully will see you next semester.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.